My name is Emily Davis, and I'm also a student with the University of Washington's ENGAGE program. I'm at the School of Aquatic and Fisheries Sciences at the UW, and just on Tuesday, I gave my talk about my research on wildfire effects on freshwater systems. As a graduate student, I get really specialized training in how to do a very specific type of research, and the ENGAGE program gave me another type of training that graduate students rarely get. I learned how to talk about my science in a way that's engaging, enlightening, and informative. In other words, less boring and technical. And you can learn more about that and our innovative program at engage-science.com. And now to our second speaker for tonight. Michelle Weirathmueller studies whales now, but she started with a bachelor's degree in geomatics engineering from the University of New Brunswick and a master's degree in ocean engineering from the University of New Hampshire. Between her master's and PhD studies, she had a taste of the real world, taking a job at a sonar company in Santa Barbara for 2 years. When she's not doing research, Michelle likes to draw cartoons, make educational science videos, tinker with her 3D printer, wow, and watch movies. Tonight, Michelle will tell us the story of Quakes and Whales and her research finding fin whale calls in earthquake recordings. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Michelle.
Thank you all for being here. I'm really excited that you could all make it. It's great to see so many faces in the audience. As you know, I am a graduate student in oceanography, and I study whales now, but I didn't always study whales. I started my career as an engineer, and I really like to learn about things like land surveying and ocean mapping, and I got really interested in finding out how sound works underwater. I worked for a sonar company for a couple of years, and here I am studying whales. And when I first started learning about whales, I realized that studying an animal is really different from studying an underwater robot or a sonar. Animals do things that you don't expect. They behave. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off just describing some of the things that I had to learn when I first started this project. First of all, the animal that I study is the fin whale. It's the second largest animal on the planet next to the blue whale. They average about 23 meters in length, so long, and also they're really sleek and really fast. They have been observed to swim at speeds exceeding 20 miles per hour, and they're so fast that they're sometimes nicknamed the Greyhound of the sea. There are two types of whales in this world: whales that have teeth and whales that do not have teeth. Fin whales fall into the second category. They don't have any teeth. But don't worry, they make up for it. They have these things called baleen plates. Baleen plates are made of the same thing as your fingernails or your hair, and they hang down from the whale's upper jaw, and they use these baleen plates for feeding. They're filter feeders. So what they do is they open their mouths really wide and they swim forward into water and prey, and they engulf a huge volume of water. They close their mouth partially, and then they push the water out, trapping prey all along the inside of those baleen plates. And then all they have to do is sweep their tongue along the inside, and that's dinner. I don't know about you guys, but I have a favorite food. I really like cheese. Fin whales also have a favorite food. They most prefer krill. Krill are these little shrimp-like creatures that live in the ocean. They're just a few centimeters long, and to put that into a sort of to demonstrate the scale of that, it would be sort of, fin whales eating krill would be sort of like if you or I decided to eat things the size of sesame seeds exclusively. But fin whales, they'll veer away from their favorite food, and they'll eat things like small schooling fishes or squid or octopus even sometimes, or even these tiny little creatures called copepods. So the fact that they're not the most picky eaters could actually help them in the long run. It might actually help, the survival of their species. Unfortunately, fin whales and many other large whales are endangered. And this is largely because of really aggressive commercial whaling during the first and middle part of the 20th century primarily. But this is a painting that was done in 1690, and it's showing whaling happening, and it's off the coast of Norway. And at this time, the whaling that was happening wasn't really threatening entire populations of whales. And the reason for this is because it was really difficult to capture and kill a whale at that time. It was really hard to keep up, especially with the fast whales like fin whales. And also, a lot of whales like fin whales, when they're killed, they just sink. And so it's really difficult to actually get them back to shore once they're killed. Eventually, though, people started coming up with techniques that made catching and killing whales really efficient. And so there were improvements in vessel technologies, so the boats were actually fast enough to keep up with the faster whales. There were exploding tipped harpoons, and they even would do this thing where they would pump the animals up with air so that they would float at the surface long enough for the whales to be towed back to shore or back to a processing ship. So after several decades of this, the numbers of large whales started to really plummet. Definitely by the 1950s, scientists knew that what was happening wasn't sustainable. Finally, by the late 1980s, commercial whaling was banned in all oceans. And so that was a good thing. And but by that time, the number of whales was already really low. And so even though it's now decades later, those populations have not fully recovered. Some of them are doing better than others, but so they are still at risk. So their numbers are really low, and they're still at risk from human activities that are happening. So one of the things that happens is they can get hit by large ships. So every year there are more ships in the ocean, and the more ships there are, the higher likelihood it is that these ships will come into contact with a whale. There's also a chance that they can get tangled up in fishing gear, and there's also a lot of noise in the ocean. So the ocean is actually kind of a noisy place. There's a lot of natural sounds in the ocean, from earthquakes, from lightning, and from surface waves. But with all of these ships in the ocean, there's a lot more noise. And even if it doesn't harm the whales physically, it can still interfere with their communication with each other so that the things that they need to do to survive. So what can we do about this problem? How can we help these whale populations recover? Well, I'm going to give you sort of a case study. I'm going to tell you about something that happened on the East Coast. So this is the coast of Massachusetts. There's Boston, and there's this area called Stellwagen Bank that is off the coast of Massachusetts, and it's this really vibrant, there's a lot of marine life in this area, and also there's the North Atlantic right whales that like to hang out here. North Atlantic right whales are very endangered. There are only a few hundred individuals left, probably about 300 or 400, and so if any of them gets hit by a ship and killed, it's really devastating for the recovery of that population. So what makes this really bad is that the Port of Boston is really busy, and there are a lot of ships that go in and out of there every day, and there's a shipping lane that goes right through Stellwagen Bank. So what they did was they went to Stellwagen Bank and they tried to figure out where the right whales like to hang out, where are their favorite hangout spots. And once they figured that out, they shifted the shipping lane slightly so that there was a lot lower likelihood that there would be whales in the shipping lane. And they did even better than that. They set up acoustic listening buoys all along the shipping lane. And anytime they picked up a right whale call, that sort of gets transmitted to mariners, and you can even download, if you're on the bridge of a ship going into or out of the Port of Boston, you can download an app onto your iPad or your iPhone, and you can actually see a visual of if there's a whale up in front of you, and then you can do whatever you need to do to try to avoid coming into contact with that animal. So it's really great because we can combine new technologies with our desire to help these endangered animals and actually try to do something that might help their populations recover. But in order to do any of these things, in order to help these animals, we really need to know where they are. The only reason that shifting the shipping lane worked was because they knew where the right whale's favorite hangout spots were. When you look at this picture, you're probably thinking to yourself, where's Waldo? And Waldo is actually in the middle blue boat, just so that you don't have to worry about that. But I want you to actually look at this and think to yourself, where's Whaldo? Fin whales are big, they're fast. They spend a lot of time really, really far from shore, so it's really hard to keep track of where they are in the ocean at any given time. One way to think about how whales are distributed in the ocean is to think about how they migrate, how they move around through the seasons. This is an example of a typical baleen whale migration. This is the humpback whale's migration in the North Pacific Ocean. And so humpback whales, during the winter, they go to high latitudes where there's lots of food available for them. And in the summer, they go down to lower latitudes where the water is warmer and calmer, and that's where they go for breeding and calving. They have their babies there. Fin whales are a bit more confusing as far as where they spend their time. Basically, fin whales have been seen and heard throughout their range at all times of year. So there's no clear migratory pattern. We know that they do follow some kind of patterns as they move around the ocean, but we still don't understand what drives their movements to go from one place to another. So one way to better understand where whales are in the ocean is to do visual surveys. And this is probably the oldest and probably still the most common method of trying to learn where whales are. And the way it works is you have trained marine mammal observers, usually on a ship that's quite a lot bigger than the one in the photo, or on planes, and they have binoculars and they look out over the water, and anytime an animal comes to the surface, they count it. And the great thing about visual surveys is that you don't just count the whales, but you can also observe what they're doing. So you can tell if they're feeding or if it's a mother and a calf, that kind of thing. The downside is that you only see them when they're at the surface, and you also can't see what they're doing when it's nighttime or when the water is really rough. So that kind of rules out a lot of time, for example, in the winter in the North Pacific Ocean. Another thing that you can do, and that scientists do, is put tags on whales. So they put tags on the whales' backs or on their dorsal fins, and those tags can stay on for sometimes weeks, months, sometimes more than a year at a time, and you can track where an animal moves over a really large distance. These types of surveys are, as you can probably imagine, logistically really difficult, and they're also very expensive. So in a given tagging survey, typically only a few individuals are tagged. So you can follow those individuals over a large distance, but you don't get an idea of the population as a whole. That brings me to the work that I do and that we do in our lab. So we basically listen in on whale conversations. I like to think that I eavesdrop on whales. The way that you measure sound underwater is kind of like how you record sound in air. So the underwater version of a microphone is called a hydrophone. And if we want to use the sounds that we're recording that the whales are making, it's really important to understand why they're making those sounds. So one of the reasons that whales make sounds is to find food. And this is really more common among the toothed whales that I mentioned earlier. So baleen whales don't really do this. But it's called echolocation, and they make a call and the sound travels through the water and echoes off their prey so that they can figure out where their food is. Another reason for making sounds is for communication. So for example, one animal might find some food and let its buddies know where that food is. And then of course finding a mate is sort of a subcategory of communication. And this one's really important for fin whales because only male fin whales have ever been observed to make sounds. So it's generally assumed that the sounds that fin whales make are some sort of breeding display. So they're making these calls to try to attract females or possibly to establish their territory and let the other male whales know, this is my space. So what does a fin whale call sound like? Well, fin whale calls are really loud and they're really, really low pitched. They're around 20 hertz. Human ears can hear about between 20 hertz and 20,000 hertz. So fin whale calls are really at the very lower end of human hearing. So their calls are about 1 second long. So they call, it's like a 1 second call, they wait 20 seconds, they make another call, they wait another 20 seconds, they make another call, and so on, for hours at a time, pausing only to take breaths. Their calls are so loud and so regular, they're kind of like clockwork. In fact, when they were first recorded, people thought, well, they didn't know what it was. They assumed it was not, there's no way this could be a biological signal. People thought it might be some kind of enemy submarine detector. Others thought that it was a geophysical signal, but eventually they did sort of pin it down to, okay, it's these giant whales making this sound. Okay, so I'm going to play a recording of about 5 minutes of fin whale calls, and I'll just orient you to what we're looking at here. So people who study sound like to not only just listen to the sound, but also have a way to visualize it. So this image is called a spectrogram, and as you move from left to right, we're increasing in time. So we're looking at about a 5-minute segment of data. As you move from bottom to top, that's increasing pitch or frequency, and the colors of this image are indicating loudness. So the darker colors mean that it's quieter, and the brighter colors mean that it's louder. And the fin whale calls are these little green kind of vertical blips that are about sort of midway along the frequency axis. So they're those little vertical lines. And I'm going to play it, and I think it'll become a little bit more clear. Okay, so as you probably could read on the screen while the video was playing, this clip has been sped up so that we can actually hear it. And so instead of 20 seconds between the call, it's much less. And instead of it being 5 minutes long, it's only about 30 seconds long. And that rumbling sound that you heard sort of partway through, that's not a fin whale call. That's probably a vessel passing nearby. So I mentioned that sound is normally recorded underwater on these instruments called hydrophones, or these underwater microphones. And it would be really great if we could just blanket the entire ocean floor with hydrophones and listen to fin whales, you know, for as long as we wanted. But that kind of experiment is really expensive, and it's kind of difficult to get funding to do something of that scale. So wouldn't it be great if there were already instruments out there collecting data for something else entirely that we could just sort of hop on and do piggyback science? Well, as you probably know from my introduction and the description of this talk, there is another way, and it is to use seafloor seismometers. So both of these photographs are showing seafloor seismometers, and these are on the seafloor, and they are at a water depth of about 2,000 meters. They're off the coast of Vancouver Island. This one is drilled into a hunk of rock, and that one is being buried in the mud on the seafloor. And what they do is, as you probably saw in Shelley's talk, they measure the shaking of the earth, and in this case, the shaking of the seafloor. And it just so happens that fin whale calls are so loud and so low pitched. They're loud, they're booming, they shake the seafloor. It's kind of like if you're in your room and you're playing really loud music and you've got a lot of bass and maybe your walls shake. Well, it's kind of like that. And so the fin whale makes a call, the sound travels through the ocean, hits the seafloor, and you get a whale quake. Seismometers don't know the difference between a whale quake and an earthquake. They just measure any kind of shaking in the ground. And so it's great because they measure the calls of these fin whales. And I can then go in and I can tell the difference between a fin whale call and an earthquake. They do look different in the data, and I can pick them out and figure out where the fin whales are over time and over space. This map is showing about 70 seafloor seismometers that are spread out over a really large distance. So you can see it's along the west coast of the US and Canada. It starts way up near Vancouver Island and goes all the way down to Northern California. And these instruments are sort of giving us a really great snapshot of a pretty significant portion of the potential migratory range of fin whales. So we do see a lot of fin whales passing through this area. Of course, these instruments are not designed to look at fin whale calls, and this is another network that's sitting there trying to measure seismic activity to try to help us understand when the next big one is going to happen on the West Coast. This map is showing earthquakes for about a 100-year span between 1900 and 1999, and the reason I'm showing this is just to illustrate that earthquakes happen all over the place, and there are seafloor seismometers in a lot of different places in the world. So what would be great is if we could take the techniques that we're developing for these instruments just off our coast here and apply them to instruments all around the world so that we can really get a better idea of where's whale dough. So this is potentially a really great thing because we can figure out where fin whales are so that we can help better protect them from the risks that I described before. That concludes my talk. I just want to say a really quick thank you to all of the folks that make the Engage program happen. They do a great job. It was a lot of fun, and a huge thank you to Town Hall Seattle and all of the people that work at Town Hall Seattle for making this possible for us. Thank you. I'd be happy to take questions if you have any.
So are fin whales the loudest noise producers in the ocean? Number two, how far apart are their seismometers? And how close does the whale have to be to one to get picked up? And does it get picked up by more than one?
Oh, that's a lot of questions. Okay. So the first question is, are the fin whales the loudest whales? And the loudest noise producers. Okay, well, they are very loud, and so their calls are about 190 decibels, which isn't the same kind of measurement that you use in air, but it's really, really loud. The only other whale that comes close to being that noisy is the blue whale, so the largest, and that's also really close. Those instruments, the seismometers, are spaced at about maybe 70 to 100 kilometers from each other, and each instrument, it really depends. So how far away you can detect a fin whale call really is dependent on how deep the water is for a number of reasons related to just the physics of how sound moves in water. But for example, in a water depth of 2,000 meters or 2,500 meters, we can see the animals out to about 20 to 30 kilometers away. So a given instrument in that network that I showed, if there's a whale nearby, the call will probably only get picked up on one instrument at a time because they're spaced pretty far apart relative to that. Yes?
So you're just collecting the data or using the data that's been collected by others, right? So
Mm-hmm.
is that just like a massive data mining effort to go through and you're just looking for signals that happen approximately every 20 seconds, like at a certain frequency? Like, is that a distributed computing data mining problem to go through all of that?
Yeah, so that's actually what I've spent a lot of the first couple of years, and I'm still tweaking now, of my PhD work. Yeah, so there's big databases online that have seismic data, both land and seismic data from seafloor seismometers. And anyone can actually access this data. If any of you are interested, you can go online and check it out. So what I do is I just download this data and I write code to automatically go through and detect the calls. And I look for things like certain amplitudes and certain frequency patterns, and I have sort of automated ways of running through the data and detecting every time a call happens.
So, do you have the capability to reverse engineer that for, going back in time for long periods of time to develop a certain degree of confidence that the signal you're picking up is actually the one that you think you are. So statistically speaking, how do you check and make sure that what the signal you're getting is actually a whale and not something else?
Fin whale calls are really distinctive, and there have been a lot of people that have gone out, and the way that I know what a fin whale call looks like is because there has been a lot of work where people go out with their hydrophones in the water and they're looking out across the water and they see fin whales and they record the sounds that the fin whales make. So it's really well established by a lot of different experiments and a lot of different people that that particular sound is associated with fin whales, and it's very distinctive, and there's really nothing else that looks quite like it. Earthquakes, surprisingly enough, look a bit like fin whale calls, but we can still tell those apart by certain particular characteristics. Yes?
Are you able to tell one fin whale from another fin whale?
Not acoustically yet. Actually, I don't even know if we would be able to. Their calls are really, really similar from one call to the next. And at this point, we still are unable to tell individuals apart.
So is that a problem for actually tracking them as they go from one seismogram to the next? Like, are you able to actually follow the same group of whales?
Yeah, we don't actually know whether we're following a given individual. What I'm able to do is to kind of look at things as, well, there are a lot of fin whale calls here, and then there are a lot of fin whale calls here, and a lot of fin whale calls here, and try to follow them as a population rather than at the individual level.
Your spectrographs seem to show two kinds of spikes in slightly different frequencies. Any idea what that's determined on?
Yeah, so you guys probably noticed in the spectrogram that there were a couple of different frequencies. I'm not going to try to skip through all the slides to show it, but what happened is they would alternate so that it was kind of like a high, low, and at this point, that's an open question. The scientific community that studies fin whales particularly is still asking this and trying to determine. We don't know if it's one whale that has sort of this vocal repertoire that includes changes in frequencies, or if it's two whales that are swimming very close together that are calling back and forth. We still are unsure about that. Yes?
How close do you get to estimating their location? Is it just based on where the seismometer is, or can you guess their distance from it based on the call?
I'm kind of laughing a little bit because that's exactly what I'm trying to do right now. First I should preface this with, if you have several instruments spaced very closely together, you can actually track an animal. If you can hear a given call on several instruments, you can triangulate to where that animal was when it made the call. And my colleagues in my lab group, Dax Soul and my advisor William Wilcock, have actually done that with a closely spaced seismic network. But when I can only see one whale at a time on a given instrument, it's tough to try to estimate how far away it is, but there are ways, because when I hear a call, when I see a call in the data, I don't just see that one call, I also see a series of echoes. So the whale makes a sound and it bounces, it kind of reverberates from between the sea surface and the sea floor. And by looking at the spacing between each of those echoes, I can try to make a guess at how far away the animal is.
Whose seismic network are you using, and can you lay maps over what you're using? In other words, are you using just the west coast of the United States, and now you're going to be able to lay a map of distribution of fin whales on the west coast of the United States, or are you using off Japan?
So I've actually looked at a few different kind of experiment, and that's a big seismic experiment. It's a 4-year experiment. I've looked at the Neptune, Canada. It's a cabled observatory, and there are a couple of other ones that I've looked at. And so far, I've done a lot of technique development where I look at small groups of these instruments. And what I'm hoping to do is eventually, what you're talking about, look at the whole thing and come up with a big picture of what's going on.
That's all the time we have for questions. Thanks again, Michelle.